Hey everybody, welcome to Performance Anxiety on the Pantheon Podcast Network. I am your host, Mark, and I want to thank our sponsor, AKG, for setting us up with their Podcaster Essentials kit. The Lyra mic and the set of headphones that come in it are amazing. If you've ever thought of starting your own podcast, this is hands down the best way to do it. Poet Joseph Massey was kind enough to spend a little time with me. He discovered poetry after a particularly troublesome childhood, which included neglectful parents and spending one school year by himself in an auditorium. He spent his time after that reading and writing poetry, corresponding with some of the most influential poets alive like Sid Corman, Robert Bly, and Allen Ginsberg, who gave him a lot of advice and encouragement. Joseph was so dedicated to his art that he wound up living alone in a shack and almost drinking himself into oblivion. And just as he was turning everything around, he was blindsided by unfounded and anonymous accusations which cost him his livelihood. But he's rebuilding and has found a strength that he didn't even know he had. But that probably won't keep him from getting texters' thumbs like Kanye. Follow Joseph on social media at jmasseypoet. Subscribe to his Substack for regular poetry fixes. Follow us at Performance ANX for regular podcast fixes. Give us a coffee fix at ko-fi.com/performanceanxiety. Merch is at performanceanx.threadless.com. Now let's ease into our conversation with poet Joseph Massey on Performance Anxiety, part of the Pantheon Podcast Network.
This is the poet Joseph Massey. I'm on Performance Anxiety Podcast. And buy my book, A New Silence. Published in 2019 by Shearsman Press. You can get it on Amazon, and you can follow me on Substack. Subscribe to my newsletter, josephmassey.substack.com. That worked. Okay, good.
Like I said, this will be the least academic podcast you've ever been on. So.
All right. We'll see.
Hopefully it'll be a fun one, though.
Okay.
Oh, man. I don't know what's going on with my throat today.
Well, what's going on with mine is that the wildfires from the West Coast have made their way all the way. The fumes and the smoke have made their way to Massachusetts somehow, 3,000 miles away. Maybe
that's what's going on. I'm in Virginia.
Maybe, but yeah, here it's been hazy skies, and it's from wildfires 3,000 miles away, man. And but it's very irritating. That's
amazing. You know, you'd think that stuff like that would dissipate over 3,000 miles.
It's amazing. I mean, just to travel that long, a vaporous substance like that. I mean, yeah, I guess it just catches a stream and that's it. But so it's caused a bit of a scratchy throat, but I feel good. Good.
Well, I'm glad you could join me and discuss a little bit of poetry because I don't really know much about it. But through having a couple of poets on the podcast, I've really started to develop an interest in it. And, I'd like to learn more about it. So I kind of discovered you through Twitter, through a post. I follow a few people that are apparently really big fans of yours, like Patricia Heaton and a few other people. And they would like your posts and retweet them. And I said, well, all right, let me look into this guy. And I liked what I've read. I don't know much about it, but it's very interesting to me. Not only the poetry, but the visual aspect of your poetry as well. I'm a photographer, so that kind of catches my eye when I see something that's unusual, like some of the poems that you've published, and we'll get into that a little later. But I'm very excited to have you on.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
And to find out where you're at now, obviously we need to go back and see where you've come from. And I know that you didn't exactly have it easy growing up, and we don't need to go into too much detail with anything because I've seen interviews and I've listened to some podcasts and you've covered it pretty well. And if anybody is interested in going back and finding out more about that, you've written an amazing article on Quillette, and it's been published in other areas, and people have read it as a podcast. And so I would recommend if anybody's interested in that, more detail about everything that's gone on, check those out, because I think you've pretty much covered everything. There's really no new ground that we're going to uncover by going over it yet again.
Yeah.
So where did you grow up? You grew up kind of in the area that I live in right now, didn't you? Like, it was in Delaware?
I lived in Delaware from the age of 13 to 21, but prior to that, I lived in an area called Chichester, Pennsylvania. It's not far from Philly. It's lots of little refinery towns, dirty old towns.
Right. Like the Pogues said.
Like the Pogues said, yeah.
And were you an avid reader as a kid? What were you interested in growing up? Was it reading? Was it music? Was there artwork?
Well, when I was a little kid, I was totally into action figures and totally into coming up with my own theater, my own worlds alone. You know, I didn't like to play with other kids so much unless it was some kind of sports related thing. And I was physically active, but my favorite thing was just be alone, you know, with a cinder block somewhere in a corner of a yard that hasn't been touched in forever, and just play with my action figures. But around the age of 12, I started reading a lot more, and I write about this somewhat at length in the Quillette essay that you mentioned. I found a biography about Jim Morrison. Didn't like the Doors, didn't care about the Doors, but for some reason I bought this biography.
You're more of a Fine Young Cannibals guy, I hear.
I think at the time I had FYC carved into the back of my head, shaved into the back of my head. And it was some old school barber did it, and he hated my guts for asking him to do something so time consuming and pointless. He had no idea who the Fine Young Cannibals were. So yeah, I wasn't really a Doors fan, but I became a fan of who Jim Morrison was when he was younger. And because I saw myself in him as far as being a delinquent but being smart. And I read the books that this book said he read, and I got interested in Arthur Rimbaud, the French poet, and then really got deeply into the Beat generation, so to speak. Jack Kerouac in particular, Allen Ginsberg, right. And on and on. It was the age of 12 in the 6th grade that's when I became a poet.
So that's when you actually started to write your own work?
Yeah, I was in a permanent in-school suspension. They about a month into the school year, they told me, don't go to class anymore. Just go sit in the auditorium. And I don't think they could get away with that now.
I was going to say, I don't even think back then that was legal.
I seriously doubt it was legal. A lot of things that went on in that school were not legal. This is Harlan Elementary in Wilmington, Delaware. And it's a very old school. It was a very rough school, you know, full of kids who are really poor. So most of the kids didn't have much bandwidth for school itself, but they were acting out their own traumas as well. Yeah. You know, and yeah, I acted out quite a bit and defended myself when I was challenged. And they knew I was smart, and they said, just go sit in the auditorium. And it was this very old auditorium, really kind of beautiful, almost like sitting in a church or something. You know, I really liked being in that kind of solitude, and that's where I started writing.
They just left you alone in there? Did they have teachers come in and try to teach anything, or you're just there by yourself?
There was a music teacher who took an interest in me, and she would drag me out of the auditorium occasionally, and she would have me help her do things in her classroom.
Wow.
Yeah, they thought I had some musical talent. The band teacher said I had a horn lip, and he tried to get me to play trumpet, but there was no practicing trumpet in a apartment building, and then with my mother and stepfather, they couldn't handle it, and I couldn't really take the trumpet to like the courtyard in this complex of apartment buildings. It just would have been too embarrassing for me, so I had to give it up.
That. Horn lip. I've never heard that. That almost sounds insulting.
It does.
You got
that's probably
horn
something
lip.
else that's illegal.
Yeah.
But I had it. He said I had like the best tone he's heard in quite some time. So I guess that's all has something to do with the horn lip. You were writing? What were you doing with your poems in the 6th grade? I mean, were you just writing them and collecting them? And
just trying to get through day to day? Because I know, like you said, your mom and your stepdad were pretty abusive and drug addicts, and your grandmother had her own issues, which you go,
That's right.
like you said, you go through that in pretty good detail in that article. So what were you doing with your poetry? Did you have a plan for it?
Not at all. No, I had a composition book. It was just your classic kind of marble cover composition book. And it was just therapeutic to fill it up with this language that wanted to come out of me. And at that time, I hadn't really found my footing, but it felt great to see my words on the page. And it just felt amazing to write, to articulate, or to attempt to articulate the world around me or what was going on in my head. But I had no intention of doing anything with, I had no ambition in that sense. There was nothing, I wasn't thinking about a career at 12, but I was really, really just wanting to survive, and poetry became a means of survival. And that was its most important function to me at that age, certainly.
Did you show anybody the work that you were writing?
No, but my grandmother found that notebook that I had first started writing in and burned it.
Oh.
Because it was blasphemous, she said. It was blasphemous.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
There were dirty words. There are too many curse words, I guess. I don't know. She said it was filth. And
Wow.
yeah, I was staying, I stayed with her in the summers, and I was kind of turning the corner of the house, walking down the little sidewalk towards the back porch, and there was all this smoke. And there was my grandmother, who was like 4'7", wearing a muumuu with flames, at her feet, wearing her Dr. Scholl shoe, kind of stomping out the ashes. And
Wow.
yeah, and so I learned how to. I had to hide my notebooks from that day forward.
So you were still determined to write. That didn't discourage you at all.
It upset me, but it also was some kind of affirmation that I was writing something that had an effect on somebody, on my grandmother anyway.
That's a good point. That's kind of affirmation that you have an aptitude for it.
Yeah. I succeeded in some way. That was my first review, really. It was just seeing it burning.
That's a hell of a review, man.
The best one yet.
Yeah. And you started writing and reaching out to other poets, some very well-known poets that even I know, like Allen Ginsberg. How did you decide to just start to reaching out to these people?
Well, at that time I was living in Dover, Delaware, which is pretty barren for a kid who's interested in books and poetry and the arts. We lived in a trailer park behind a NASCAR stadium.
Oh, wow.
And and it was just very bleak. The landscape was bleak. And I didn't know anybody who liked poetry, read poetry, wanted to talk about poetry. But I spent a lot of time at the library, and that provided me with all kinds of company in the form of books, but also in the form of this reference book called Contemporary Poets. And I forget who published it, but it had like bibliographies for the poets, and for most of the poets had their address.
That's
so
insane.
Yeah. So they had Allen Ginsberg's P.O. box. I didn't expect a response. I didn't know. I wrote to him. I think I wrote it on a typewriter with like some drawing paper, because I didn't even have actual typing paper, so it was like very thick paper. And
wow.
And I sent him a bunch of poems, maybe 3, not that many, and he responded. And it was a handwritten postcard in an envelope, and he said the poems were better than what he wrote at 15.
Wow.
And told me to read William Carlos Williams and Gregory Corso.
Now, at that time, I'm just assuming you knew how high of a profile he had.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he was a legend. Yeah, he was a legend. I mean, he was godlike to me at the time. And I wouldn't say he's godlike to me now, or no human is, but I I have even a better appreciation or a stronger appreciation for his work now than I did then. I think just with time and experience, I can go deeper into his work. Okay. Whereas at the time, I was still learning. I was still trying to understand why Ginsberg or any poet would do certain things in their poems. And I still always try to figure that out when I read, but I just have a better sense of things now. But yeah, I was fully aware of who he was culturally, as a figure, as an iconic figure.
Yeah.
And I was blown away to get that mail from him.
Oh yeah, that had to be amazing.
Yeah. But nobody in my family had any idea I told them, but they were like, oh, okay.
Whatever. Yeah.
Who's that?
Yeah. Oh,
good for you.
Man. Yeah. Woo. So that one must, okay. So you've got some amazing advice and encouragement from Allen Ginsberg. Who else were you reaching out to at that time? Who else took an interest in you?
Robert Bly did as well.
Wow.
And that was another total surprise. He sent me a typed up letter, a copy of a recent book of his. I don't remember the title, but it was a book of prose poems, which was another layer of education at the time, because I didn't really know what prose poems were. I had some sense of it from Rimbaud, but had never seen a whole book of prose poems by an American poet.
You're probably going to have to explain some of this to me, because like I said, I'm brand new to trying to get into poetry. So what is the difference in prose?
Well, prose poem, it's kind of an oxymoronic term, because poetry is not prose. That's kind of what distinguishes it.
Okay.
But basically, a prose poem it's a poem that's in paragraph form. It's in sentences. There are no line breaks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's a block of text.
Oh, okay. So that makes more sense to me now.
Yeah. Yeah.
When did you first get published? I'm assuming that's the right term.
Yeah. I was published in my middle school's literary magazine.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. I never went to gym class because it was just a nightmare. I was very introverted at the time.
Oh, you're already in the auditorium. You should have been in there.
Yeah. Well, this is after that.
Okay.
This is when I lived in Dover. I was in another school, but I would go sit in the library, and they just had a bin where people could just put their poems for the literary magazine, and I would just write them on the spot right there and put like 3 or 4 a day in the bin.
Wow.
And they published a few of them on like one page, and all the poems were illustrated. They didn't know what to make of mine really, so they just illustrated it with scribbles, just like some scribbles. Like I don't know what they were trying to get across. I don't know, some kind of fog or something. I don't know, but
interesting.
Yeah, but that was exciting, even though it was just the middle school literary magazine. But the first serious publication was in a magazine called House Organ, and the poem they published is really terrible. But the editor knew how young I was, and I think wanted to really be supportive, and he ended up being supportive. Kenneth Warren is his name. He lived, I think, in Indianapolis. He was a librarian. He passed away some years ago, but I was introduced to him by one of my correspondents, one of these older poets I looked up to as a mentor.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so I appeared in House Organ periodically for years, but that first poem was terrible. Yeah. Really bad.
So you started a correspondence with Sid Corman.
Yeah.
And he was really important to you.
Yeah, he was.
How did he help you out? How did he change your life, basically?
Well, the first line of the first letter he sent to me was, "Your life is about to change."
Wow.
And it absolutely did. And by the time I'd received his first letter, I had read at least 20 books of his, because I was living near the campus of University of Delaware at the time, and they had quite a collection of his work.
Oh, wow.
And many of the books were very limited edition, letterpress printed, bound in Japanese style. Oh. So they were very intimate, and his poems are very short. And what I learned and what I gleaned from that experience of reading his work in that library was just how intimate poetry could be between poet and reader, with the book as a means as the vehicle for those words, and how the white space around the poem was just as important, almost as important as the words themselves, because that white space lends intimacy to the poem. And I learned that just intuitively from reading his work. It wasn't anything I had, articulated or clarified, or I wasn't, writing artist statements at the time or anything, but it was a deep education just reading his books. And then when he started writing to me, I started writing to him, and he would write back right away, even though he lived in Japan. He would write back the day he got letters. He was he was very proud of himself for always getting back to people immediately. And so I would, I'd write to him and I'd hear from him in a couple weeks. And he really advanced my self-education by pointing me towards poets I had never heard of before, who, like Lori Niedecker, who is a poet in the Midwest, who wrote very short poems, very technically skilled short poems about the natural world around her, and also the town she lived in. She wrote a kind of folk poetry, they call it.
Oh, okay.
But it was also the images are very strong and clear in her work. And poets like that who I don't think I would have heard of at that time unless someone told me to read them. And I was so dependent on my correspondence suggesting things to me, read this, read that, and I always took their suggestions, and Sid was always ready for a suggestion. And Sid was also very blunt in his criticism of the poems that I sent, which I needed. I needed that. I wanted it. I wasn't offended or put off by his criticism, which could be harsh. Yeah.
That, how old were you at this time approximately?
19.
Wow.
19. Yeah.
That's impressive, because, you and I have corresponded a little bit before this, and I went to college for photography, and one of the big things that they would do would be to do critiques, where you would shoot 10 rolls of film, be in the darkroom for hours, pick 3 or 4 images and put them up on the wall, and the entire class would go around and critique them. And I wasn't ready for that. I took it personally, and so I wasn't prepared to be critiqued with my work. Much better at it now. But at that age, there's no way I could have done that. It's so impressive to me that somebody that age could take that type of criticism and use it and learn from it. I was not mature enough to do that.
I think he respected it that I was able to take the criticism, because he was always very critical. He was the editor of a very important literary magazine, really a seminal publication called Origin. And he initially accepted work by submission. People could just send work, whoever could just send work to Sid for consideration. And he rejected one woman, rejected her poems, gave her some comments that were typical Sid. They were maybe kind of sharp, but he writes about it in the introduction to an anthology of stuff that was in Origin. He said that this woman threatened to kill him, basically.
Whoa.
Yeah. He got death threats for it. So at that point, he decided he was only going to solicit poems from poets for Origin. There would be no more open submissions. But yeah, he would get some very dramatic responses from people who did not like his criticism. He in some interview he mentioned that he told a younger guy that his poetry just wasn't there yet. He's got a long way to go. And the kid flipped out and started yelling at Sid, who was a very old man at the time. And he kept saying something like, I just wanted some affirmation. But Sid was very interested in the word affirmation. Like, this kid wanted my affirmation. He was kind of taken aback by that. And this was in the early aughts. And that kind of offense is even more prevalent now, where
for sure.
You can't. These are people graduating from MFA programs. You'd think they'd be ready to get some critique because they've spent, 3 or 4 years in workshops. But in workshops now, in MFA programs, you can't really be honest because you'll offend someone.
Yeah. And you can't critique things anymore. It's unbelievable.
It's a real disservice to say the least. It's not just a disservice to the art, but it's contributing to its decline culturally. Poetry's always had a hard time kind of at least seeming to be relevant. I mean, I think I know poetry's not going anywhere. It's always been a kind of underground current that's essential. It's part of that stream that culture goes downstream. Poetry is a major part of that ecosystem flowing. And, but there are so many poets poets, quote unquote, that I just did air quotes, which is terrible. Punch myself. I'm glad this isn't video, but yeah, air quotes, poets who graduate from these programs. It's thousands every year. They don't know how to take criticism. They don't know how to criticize. They don't know how to articulate why they don't like something, or even why they like something. And I think to be an artist, you have to be able to take criticism. Otherwise, you're just not going to learn. And it shows in the work that's being published predominantly now in major journals. It's really not about the language. It's more about politics.
Well, and what's going to happen is you've got all these artists in various medium, not just poetry, but in a lot of other mediums where they can't take the critique. And so they don't learn from it. And so the generation that follows is going to be uncritiqued because this generation can't put into words what they like or what they don't like about the work that they're being shown. And so I see it maybe getting even worse.
Oh, I think so. Yeah. It's going to continue to get worse. And what's it's got to end at some point or turn into something else. I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen with the MFA world, but I wish it would just collapse completely.
Yeah, I never understood why, and I have friends who did this, because I went into photography to do it commercially. I mean, I love the fine art aspect of it. I do a lot of it now because I'm not a professional photographer anymore, but I had friends who were going through the fine arts program, and I was always curious as to what they expected to achieve by the end of it. And nobody could ever really give me an answer.
It's the same in poetry. It's like, what do you want out of this? Because, out of the thousands that graduate every year, 2%, 1% will actually get a job teaching creative writing. Yeah. So it can't be about that. Is it because you needed a 2-year or 3-year break from the world and that you're in debt for most of your life?
Exactly.
I've heard that excuse, like I wanted some uninterrupted time to work on my writing. But that's another thing. If you're in it for life, if you're really devoted to poetry, you'll find the time no matter what. You'll find the time and the space to write. So if you need workshops and institutional, scaffolding around you to write your poems that aren't very good anyway, you're doomed.
We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors. So what was your plan when you started, when you left school and you started to have to earn a living? Did you have aspirations of selling books or making poetry your living? Or was that going to be just something you did on the side always?
I never expected to make any kind of living off of poetry. And I didn't really expect to live very long because the environment that I came out of didn't provide me with very many tools to survive. And I left home at a fairly young age. I was 18 or just turned 19 and lived in really terrible rented rooms with people who were not well. And that went on for most of my early for a few years. And then when I was 22, I moved to the coast of Humboldt County, California with a girlfriend.
Okay.
And got away from Delaware and Philly, got away from family. And we were splitting the rent. It wasn't that expensive. We were renting a small Victorian house. We had plenty of space. I think the landlord just liked us, and then I think his parents had lived there and just died, and he just wanted to make a little bit of money off of it, so he let us rent the place. And yeah, I got used to living in poverty, basically. And when this girlfriend and I parted ways, I moved into a small shack that was literally a shack. It used to be used to be a woodshed. It was the woodshed behind a big Victorian house.
Oh my God.
And they did a half-assed renovation of this thing, but it was still slanted. You could roll like a pen or a pencil from one side to the other. I know, because I did it many times, drunk at night, just needing something to do. It was drafty. Wasn't insulated. The humidity was crazy. I was right by the ocean, so black mold was in this place. It was lit. I mean, and I had no money. I was barely able to pay rent, and yeah, it was those years were extremely painful, and that went on for 5 years of just intense poverty. But I didn't stop writing. I wrote throughout yeah, no, I didn't know. Nothing ever has deterred me from writing. Nothing's ever been so bad that I didn't or don't feel compelled to write. It's a way of seeing the world. It's a way of being in the world. And without it, just as when I was a kid, and now I'm 42, but it's still a means of survival, a way to survive. It gives me a sense of order, and it gives me a sense of purpose. It anchors me to the world, and it's what I needed, because I was in such dire straits in the shack that if I hadn't had poetry, who knows what would have happened. And that's been the case several times in my life. If it weren't for poetry, I don't know where I would have been.
Yeah, I mean, it's a safety. I mean, you came from an environment of substance abuse and suicide.
Yeah.
And that's to not succumb to. I mean, I know you had the problem with alcohol, but you obviously don't have a problem with suicide right now because I'm talking to you. So
that's right.
So, poetry has definitely helped you see through that. It's amazing that something like poetry, like an art form, can guide you through times that are so difficult. It's amazing.
It's an incredible gift. It's the greatest gift in my life, poetry. And, we're jumping ahead, but when I was essentially canceled, I'm doing air quotes again, canceled.
That's good for podcasting too.
Yeah. I was canceled, and I think some of the people involved in that thought that I would just stop writing poetry, and it made me want to write poetry even more, because I needed it more. I needed to feel grounded in the world in a very serious way, in a very immediate way. And there's nothing like poetry that does that for me. So yeah, I wrote a book during that experience. It was, they didn't have the effect that they intended to have, didn't pan out.
Now, before you got canceled, you had to actually have some success. So when did that start to happen? When did the turnaround happen from living in a shack to working at University of Pennsylvania and publishing books? What turned it around?
It started in the shack, because in 2005 I had published my first couple of chap books. Do you know what a chap book is?
I do not. I wanted to ask you about that.
Okay. It's a book of poetry. It comes from Scottish, and it meant cheap book. And it was when they were referring back then to pamphlets. But chapbooks are, some of them are very finely printed, but it's usually under 30 pages or so, and bound with thread or staples. And it's essentially a pamphlet, booklet. And it's kind of like to compare it to music. It's like it's like an EP, and then a full length book is it's the full length album.
Okay.
And I published a couple chap books. I self-published my first one, sent it to poets who I admired, and a well-known poet who had a well-known blog at the time. This is when people were blogging. This
Right.
is, in the early 2000s. There was no social media, and he wrote a really wonderful review of my very first chapbook, and that, people started writing to me. My community started to grow, and then that led to the next chapbook, and then the chapbooks led to my first full-length book. I have a publisher in England. They're still one of my publishers. They published my first full-length book, and that book got some really great reviews. It caught the attention of some critics who were fairly well known, or at the time really well known. And then I had work in an anthology published by, I think it was University of Iowa. It was all poems that were in homage to William Carlos Williams, and so it was while I was in the shack and publishing these chapbooks and then the full-length book that things really started to coalesce in ways that I wasn't even fully conscious of, because I was still drinking, all the time, and
Wow.
still had this drive to not survive. Like, it was comfort to me to think that I don't have to endure this forever. I didn't think I'd make it to 30.
Wow.
And
Jeez.
that made me feel good, which is a terrible thing. It's amazing that I wrote 3 books in that shack. I don't know how and the hell I did it. It's solely because the poetry was an anchor for me when there wasn't one.
Wow.
Because I didn't have anything socially. I had to steal food to survive.
Jeez.
I had a really kind neighbor who I was great friends with, and if she had like a box of stale cereal or something, she'd give it to me. But Joyce, if you're listening, thank you. I know you gave me a lot more than stale cereal. If they had a barbecue, they'd spare me a leg.
Wow.
Chicken leg.
Gosh.
Yeah, barbecue chicken leg or something. No, she was, but I had basically one friend who was my neighbor, and her cats were very close to me. I was close to them. And that was it. There was no poetry world in Arcata, California. So I was still very much alone, and I spent 8-9 years in the shack. Wow. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
And towards the end of that stay, I started to dawn. I was becoming cognizant of the fact that I was wrecking my body with drinking. And also I had a therapist who diagnosed me with PTSD. So a lot of things started to make sense.
That
a lot of the
makes sense.
symptoms I was having. Yeah, it's like the hypervigilance. Like, that was like, when I read about that, I'm like, holy shit, like that's what that is. When I'm walking down the street and there's a loud noise and I feel like I'm going to die, my heart starts racing. It's like, I'm not crazy. This is actually part of trauma that goes back to, I don't know, probably before I can really remember. So that was when things really started to turn around at that point, I guess when I was like 28, 29.
So
Yeah.
Do you have a process to your writing? I mean, do you find something you're inspired to write about and then write, or are you just constantly writing and then trying to fit what you've written? This part will go with this poem, this part will go with this poem. Is there a set process?
Not a set process, but generally there's a process, and it starts with writing in notebooks, real, like, paper, hard copy notebooks.
Okay.
Before COVID, I would do a lot of writing in the coffee shop, because I would walk from my apartment here in Massachusetts to the coffee shop, and walking really inspires me, gets the words flowing. I will see something that interests me, an image or whatever. And then I would go to the coffee shop and work it out, and then work it out even more on the computer screen. So it would go from notebook to computer, and then lots of revisions. But lately I write a lot on my phone, which feels like sacrilegious.
Wow. Yeah. That's one thing I have trouble with. I can do a lot of things on my phone, but I writing, man, I don't think I could do that.
I need to cut it out, because, well, a friend of mine warned me, because I'm writing a memoir as well, and I was writing the memoir for a while, drafting it on my phone, because it gave me separation from like sitting at a desk and feeling like I was doing a job. And so the words just kind of came out. I was writing about traumatic events, and so it felt easier to just kind of, I could type very fast with my thumbs. And anyway, a friend of mine warned me that Kanye West blew his thumbs out from texting too much.
Oh, wow.
And he had to get cortisol injections in his hands. I'm like, that's not going to happen to me. He's, I think he's like a year older than me anyway.
I've never heard
I got some time, but now I have terrible pain in my right thumb.
Is that
when
a new
I start
thing?
to text?
Is that like texter's thumb? Is that like a tennis elbow?
If it's not, it probably should. I mean, I'm sure there are many people who suffer. Maybe they don't actually, because I think the people who are typing with their thumbs as much as I do are probably teenagers who don't have to worry about, burning their thumb out.
See, I did that. I got one of those swipe keyboards. I just swipe, and that's why I get so many typos on my texts and stuff. You should see how. Oh, all right. I'll tell you a quick story. I'll probably edit this one out because I've told this a couple of times. But I had a chef on the podcast. That is an enormous mug, man. Holy God.
I drink a lot of water.
I started doing that too, and because my doctor said I really should, and my wife, she's like, you got to drink more water. All it's doing is making me pee more. I don't really feel a big benefit. I'm just going to the bathroom more. Anyway, I had this band on called Vast Robot Armies. Awesome guys. And one of the guys is a bartender at a restaurant in Kansas City named the Belfry. And he's like, you should have my boss on. She's awesome. She's really creative. I said, okay, who is she? All right, her name's Chef Selena Tio. She's been on Top Chef Masters and Iron Chef America. And yeah, awesome. If she's open to coming on, I'd love to have her. He's like, all right, I'll check with her and I'll get you guys connected. So he's like, all right, she said she's down with it. Just here's her number. Send her a text. So with my swiping thing, I start saying, hey, love to have you on. I normally record in the evenings on the weekdays. I can also do some weekends, but it came out. Sometimes I can do anal on weekends. And I didn't even look, and I hit it and I sent it. Because I was at work at the time, and I had to text or to email. I got to do it on the sly. So a minute or two later, I look at my phone, and I'm reading like, sometimes I do anal on the week. What? Oh my gosh. So I'm like, okay, I've either blown it or she's got a good sense of humor. I guess I'll figure it out. So I leaned into it, and I said, I'm sorry for that. That was a mistake. I always do anal on the weekdays. And because I figured I've either blown it or she's going to be cool with it. And she just sent me back the crying, laughing emoji. She said, weekday is fine, but let's just keep it to the podcast. So I was like, all right, cool. She's in. So
that's a happy ending, so to speak.
It was.
I thought you were gonna say you got canceled or something.
No, unfortunately, not yet. We'll see what happens if this story gets leaked out too much. But she's actually been on the podcast 3 times now. So.
Oh, good.
So, I even lost where we were at. Holy shit! This is what happens in this show. Like I said, this is the least academic show you'll ever be on. Oh,
you were just you were asking about when I started having success as a poet.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see, where was I going to go with that? When did things really start to feel like you were successful? When did the jobs at Penn come and getting, I'm assuming, I think I understand this, right? That poets will get paid to do public readings and things like that. When did all that start to happen?
Well, I moved from the coast of Humboldt County. I moved from Arcata, California, to the Pioneer Valley of Massachusetts, the western part of the state. Okay. I live in East Hampton, which is near Northampton and Amherst, and where Emily Dickinson lived. And it's a really beautiful area. I moved out here because I had friends here who I knew through correspondence, other poets, and I felt like I needed to be around other poets. I was ready to be more social, I guess.
Okay.
And so things started happening at greater frequency when I moved here. I think because I was able to connect with people at readings. I gave some readings, which I barely did that when I was in California because I hated flying. So I'd have to put a lot of work into getting myself on an airplane. So I rarely ever gave readings. And when I did, I was just completely blown out of my mind, drunk, and made absolute embarrassment of myself every single time, and scandalized myself too, in ways that will probably follow me for the rest of my life. Yeah. And so when I moved out here, a very good friend of mine said he arranged for me to read at a local kind of literary salon type establishment. And but he said, you cannot drink before you read. You got to promise me you won't drink before you read. And I agreed and kept the promise. And it felt so much better reading sober. I could hear myself. I could hear my poems. I could embody the poems with my voice in a way that it wasn't happening before because I was blackout drunk. I mean, like 20 beers before I would. I would go to a bar. I would go to a bar hours and hours before the reading and just drink.
Wow.
And then read, and it was never good. To say the least, it was never good. So moving out here, having friends face to face who cared about me, I started to really change my life. Went to AA, totally stopped drinking, learned meditation, which really was so helpful and still is so helpful to this day, especially in dealing with the PTSD symptoms I was talking about, the panic attacks, anxiety. So I started to really develop a spiritual life too. And as I was healing physically and healing spiritually, the work improved. I think it progressed, and more opportunities came to me. I had a book accepted for publication by Wave Books, which is a pretty prestigious small press in the poetry world.
Okay.
And it was that book that really blew up. This was in 2015. That book got reviewed in the New York Times, got a glowing review in the New York Times, various other major publications. So I started getting more invites to go read. I would travel to read. I started to like it.
Oh, cool.
It didn't really hit me that I could have a life in poetry that could support me until I started doing those readings, which would pay me. And then I started working for University of Pennsylvania, which was amazing. I loved the program I worked for. They would bring me down to Philadelphia a couple times a year, treat me very nicely. And I knew that I could make a life out of poetry. And that life in poetry ended the day the cancellation campaign started.
Right.
And I knew it was over as soon as it started. And it had only been 3 years. It had only been 3 years of me really trying to build a life. I didn't want to commit suicide. I didn't want to die before a certain age anymore. I no longer got comfort from thinking about taking myself out. It's like I wanted to live.
That's good.
I wanted to live. I wanted to write. I was enjoying teaching. I never expected that from myself, and then it was gone in an instant.
Like I said, we don't really have to go into detail about this. Anybody who's interested, there's more than enough resources out there, more than enough interviews you've already done and gone into great detail on this. And at some point, you've got other things to talk about.
Yeah,
we don't have to go into it, but there's enough resources out there. No, you've done a bunch of podcasts and interviews about the whole cancellation situation. But if you want to give just a brief overview as to what happened, you can go as detailed as you're comfortable going.
When I was living in the shack and drinking, I made quite a fool of myself on the internet most nights. I made many enemies that way. I made many friends that way. I was provocative. I was angry. I would start fights online. I would write manifestos. I was a wreck. And I thought that I would just drink myself to death eventually. I was really not looking at the long view of things. There was no long view at the time. And so when I started to clean myself up and started to have success in poetry, and I got involved in an affair I shouldn't have been in. It was toxic in so many ways. That ended. She was upset in a way that was frightening. She started digging into my past relationships. It was a coordinated smear campaign. It went on for about 6 months. And then when Me Too happened, I believe she saw a golden opportunity, and she got some of her friends involved, and they wrote an anonymous letter claiming I called someone hot at a poetry reading. They sent it to my publishers. They sent it to University of Pennsylvania. There was no response to the letter. I am assuming because it was a ridiculous letter.
And she was a poet as well, right?
She is a poet. Yeah. And so there was competitiveness on her end, on her side, I think. She had often made reference. I mean, and I have all of this in Gmail. I never deleted any of our correspondence. She would say that she's jealous of my success. She's jealous of my ability to connect with people on social media. She's jealous of, and she got very jealous that Wesleyan University Press accepted one of my books for publication.
Yeah.
And that really seemed to push her over the edge. So the letter that they had sent out didn't work, didn't have any effect. Somebody actually at Wesleyan University Press told me that when they received it, they thought it was a joke because of the charge seemed so flimsy. I called someone hot at a poetry reading.
Right, yeah.
But what it was a fly trap. It was like, if we put an accusation out there, it has to be taken completely seriously. During Me Too, it had to be taken seriously. It didn't matter what the accusation was. And in any interaction I had with women was looked at through that lens, that this person is bad. This interaction I had with them must have been bad. Like, one person posted on Facebook that I had looked at her like a meal, she said. He looked at me like a meal at a poetry reading, and I was chilled to the bone. I'm like, I remembered meeting this person. I didn't look at her like a meal. And I had done things that were truly wrong and offensive. I said things that were absolutely wrong, and behaved in ways at a couple of those readings that were gross, cross lines that shouldn't have been crossed. I touched a woman's breast at one of the readings, and that was the worst thing I had done, and never did it again. I never drank at a reading again. Apologized, but this is somebody who, the woman who I was in the affair with, when she was doing her orchestration of the campaign to ruin my life, she reached out to her. She knew about it because I told her. I told this person everything. So she knew all the dirt. She knew all the skeletons. And the impression she gave this person is, no, he hasn't changed. He's still an abuser, and he's still a jerk. So my past came into the present, and all the work I had done for years to change my life and to not be that person was disregarded, because this woman I was in an affair with for the last 2.5 years is saying that it's all bullshit. He's a bad person, basically. I don't know what she was telling people. And there was you couldn't question these narratives that were being developed.
No, I remember that. I mean, it happened to a lot of people.
Yeah.
And like you said, nobody that it happened to had the opportunity really to defend themselves.
Yeah, I tried. I posted on Facebook an apology. I never should have done it. This is before anybody really had a blueprint for how to respond to online mobbing. And I apologized. And as this happens every time, the apology was just ripped apart, not accepted. But no matter what I had said, it wouldn't have been accepted. Yeah,
it's like the old lawyer's trick of saying, yes or no question, have you stopped beating your wife?
It's exactly like that. Yeah, it's exactly like that. Yeah, and because the insinuation was put out there that I'm an abuser, these words kept being repeated on social media. I'm an abuser. I'm a predator. I'm a blah, blah, blah. And it's like, but there was never any evidence of that. There were no receipts being posted. And most of my interactions with people were online. So where are the receipts? And there won't be receipts, because you would see that these were consensual conversations I had with people that were later, extrapolated and looked at through this lens of, wow, he's a real piece of shit. So clearly he had bad intentions.
That hit you where you live, because you lost your job at the Penn. You lost publishers. On one of the podcasts, you were even saying that some of the people that wanted you to blurb about their book said no thank you. So poetry saved you in that instance as well. You were still writing.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I'd never been at a lower point.
Wow.
Then. I mean, I was in shock for I don't know how long. I mean, the day that it all went down, January 10th, 2018, I was definitely in shock. I mean, that day it was that letter was posted. She posted a link to this letter. They threw the anonymous letter up on a WordPress site, and the person I had been in the affair with put the link up on all of her social media accounts, and that just blew up.
Yeah.
Because the poetry world didn't have a Me Too scandal yet.
Right.
I was it. And so a lot of anger, a lot of rage was being directed at me. I was, the figurehead.
How big is the poetry community in that regard? I mean, I know it would affect your ability to be a published author or a speaking poet, but how big is that community that she was reaching?
Well, when I say it's not really a community, it's a network. It's a network of networks, and they're all connected to this MFA grid across the country. And so that's the poetry world, as they say. That's the poetry world. It's the more academic, or a lot of it's coming out of academia, because that's where poets can make money. And so the poetry world revolves around these MFA programs. And so it's more, I mean, it's thousands of people, and if you're cut out from that poetry world, which is like the establishment poetry world, then you're also cut out of those opportunities to have your work seen, to have your work published, first off.
Yeah.
And to give readings, you're not going to be invited anymore. I mean, everything was canceled that very day. I mean, yeah. People I wrote blurbs for, it was the day everything blew up, they were writing to me to tell me they can't use my blurb. There were 4 or 5 books I wrote a blurb for.
Wow. And
but yeah, workshop I had planned, they pulled out, and they were very public, and they tweeted out that they canceled their workshop with Joseph Massey, and they got many comments, thank you, and blah blah blah.
It's unbelievable. Whatever happened to hearing both sides of the story, of facing your accuser, even, it went so far to one side. I can't even believe how blinded people got.
It was blind rage.
Yeah.
And I understood where I had a sense of where a lot of the rage was coming from. People were upset. There are people in the poetry world who can be described as predators, but these people who may be predatory or who sound predatory, I've heard things over the years, they're the professors. They're the old professors who give people reference letters, who invite people to read at their schools, who give them blurbs, who whatever, favors, literary favors. That's the power. Those are the real power brokers in poetry. And
that happens in so many areas of higher education.
Yeah.
Not just the arts, in science and in liberal arts. That's how some students end up, getting ahead, whether they do that on purpose or they're groomed. It happens all the time.
That's right. Yeah. And so none of the power structure they were not called out in any way,
right,
shape or form. And they put that on me. They were also trying to make a case that I had abused my power in the poetry world. I had power. And if I did, it beats me, because I wasn't a publisher. I wasn't a curator of a reading series. I wasn't judging any contests. 'Cause book contests are a big deal in poetry. It's how most people get their books published, because there's a reading fee, and the reading fees they help support the MFA programs. It's a vicious vampiric cycle.
Wow. Oh my.
And I wasn't tapped into any of that, but they had to make the case that I was powerful. And yeah, there was no fighting the narrative. There's no fighting it.
So it's kind of like the Wizard of Oz, pay no attention to the professors behind the curtain. Look at this guy over here.
Yeah. And I, like I said, I mean, I've admitted before Me Too, like, talked about what a wreck I was, and I did things I regret. And I was very public about getting sober and changing my life. And so my shit was out there, just to say, it's not like and I know I realize I'm not saying this, and I don't even know why I feel like I should emphasize it, but yeah, I was a deeply flawed person who did things that were regrettable. But did I do things on the level and scale that they were implying? And it was all done through implication, calling me things like predator and blah, blah, blah. Well, what are the examples you have of this? What are you talking about? Nobody had anything.
Most of it was done anonymously, right? All
anonymously. This one horrible article published in a now defunct online magazine, written by a truly an activist journalist who had tweeted many times, "I hate men," and all kinds of shit like that. And I gave her an interview stupidly because I was desperate to be transparent. That was what I wanted to do. Well,
You think that can help? That's what I should do. I mean, that's a natural reaction. All right, let me explain my side. Let me tell you my side of it.
Yeah, my heart goes out to people who are in that same position, and when they start apologizing, and there are people who respond, "Don't apologize. Why are you apologizing?" It's like you don't understand. When you're being attacked in that way, it is an instinct to let people know that I'm not that. I'm not a predator. I'm not I am a safe person. I'm not. It's like So but that article that was written, if you look at it, I mean, it's an exercise in bad faith journalism. All of the people have pseudonyms. There aren't any clear accusations. It's just it's bizarre. It's making a lot out of very little.
What has happened since then? Are you obviously you're still writing? Has anybody turned around and said, we shouldn't have done what we did? Either publishers, employers, or accusers. Has anybody done an about face and brought you back?
Well, no one's brought me back. Wow. That's the thing. I do hear from people occasionally, people who ghosted me or unfriended me, and they apologize. They say they realized it went too far. Or they say lots of different things, but they would never say that in public. They would never defend me in public. Even now, 3 years after the fact, they still won't, and never will probably. And I did run into one of my tormentors who lives in this town.
Oh, wow.
And I talked about this on another podcast, but just briefly, I mean, I sort of know this guy. He's just an acquaintance, and I don't know why he latched on to me. Like he really seemed to enjoy kicking the shit out of me online. Okay. I ran into him, and he tried to walk right past me, and I said, you had a lot to say online. Well, here I am. Why don't you say it to my face? And he got very, he was irate, like, what are you talking about? I'm like, what do you mean? You spent a year tormenting the hell out of me.
What do you think I'm talking about?
Yes, calling me the worst things imaginable. And we went for a 2-hour walk.
Wow.
And he ended up apologizing.
Oh.
And and I felt pity for him, because he's a very weak, broken individual, and I forgave him. I told him that I forgive you. I don't want bad blood with you. You live in the same town. I'm not going to hold a grudge anymore. Yeah, it meant a lot to me to have that conversation, even though what he did was terribly wrong, and it doesn't let him off the hook. But forgiveness isn't really about, absolving someone of the things they did. It's really about letting your own self off the hook, not letting yourself be angry anymore, seeing that person as a human being. So
maybe one day they'll come back around and they can see you as one as well.
I hope so. I hope that conversation had some effect, but other than that, no, it's not like I do hear from people in the poetry world often, but it's always just private.
Right.
No one's asking me to send work to their magazine or whatever.
That's their loss, because from what I've been reading, it's amazing. I love the way you visually shape poems. I mean, there's an art to the placement of the word on the page. The negative space on the page was just as important as the words themselves, and it's just amazing what you're able to do. I'm looking at one of the poems right now, Contain. The line you wrote that really has stuck with me, and my favorites so far, I'm going to air quote myself here. No thing until detonated into its word. That one sentence, it's just detonated into its word. It's just, that struck a chord with me, and it's making me think about things a lot differently. Just that one line. Something that isn't it's a thing, but we don't make it a thing until we give it a word. And the way using the word detonated was just amazing to me. That really struck me.
Thank you. Yeah, I think a lot about how language shapes and informs the world we're in, our sense of a world, and what would this world look or feel like without language? Would there be a world without language, without this system of demarcating things and classifying them? Would objects have their own independence anymore? Like it's like with language, we can identify things and we can find our way through a world that is still always bewildering, but language is I don't know if there's a world without language, but I think about that all the time. I suppose there is, I mean, in a very literal sense, but it wouldn't be the world that we know now.
No, and unfortunately, I think that language and writing in general just doesn't seem to hold the value that it used to, and I blame the internet for that. I mean, if you pick up any article online and you can pull out 5-10 typos, nobody edits just for basic grammar anymore. I blame the proliferation of online magazines, I guess, and more air quotes, for that. It's like quantity over quality.
Yeah.
Is that the same with modern poetry? I know you've been very critical of modern American poetry. Is that being affected in the same way?
Yeah, and a very actually in a literal sense, there was a poetry movement that went on for a few years called alt-lit, like alternative literature, and their whole thing was using like internet language, typos, emojis. It's as terrible as it sounds, and I think that had a real influence on the next crop of poets that came up, where they're really their language lacks a certain integrity as language. It's like a painter who never learned how to draw. It's like they don't have the basic ability to write a good sentence, to write a strong sentence. Could they do that? Probably not. I mean, so the work reflects in a way the fragmented attention span of someone who basically who's grown up with computers, with cell phones, with smartphones, with social media. I think it's had a detrimental effect on poetry, but also the poets who take poetry seriously as an art form and not just as a vessel for self-expression. Maybe this is me being optimistic. I am drinking tea here. The caffeine's coursing through my veins, but maybe the real poets will shine even brighter when kind of these chips start to fall, the chips of this, the culture war, so to speak. I mean, I hope to God it ends at some point.
Yeah.
With the pendulum on the other side, not too far on the other side, not smashing through the wall on the opposite end, but just kind of stabilized. Real poets will always exist. As long as there are human beings, there will be real poets. Will they necessarily be successful? Would I have been able to have the success that I had in the early 2000s, or the early teens, I guess they would say?
Yeah.
With getting the books published, working for, getting readings, UPenn, blah, blah. Would that even be happening now for me? Probably not, because of who I am. It probably wouldn't be happening. And I'm not opposed to people wanting to diversify their magazines and their MFA classes and whatnot, but there's something destructive about identity politics when it meets art. And it's not just poetry, it's the other arts as well, because the politics tends to override the actual art, the writing or the painting or the music. It's more about the political message is what's, it's front and center. And yeah,
and that's why I believe that somebody like you or the next Ginsberg and Kerouac is not going to come from an MFA program, because that's not what they were about. They didn't go through that to learn poetry, how to write poetry. So you can't expect the next revolutionary, influential poet to come through that program. It's going to be somebody who's completely outside of that whole community.
Yeah. Or someone who got kicked out of an MFA program and saw the light or something. I don't know, exactly. But you're right. And I think that MFA bubble is not sustainable. It just seems, how much longer can that go on, especially if we enter another lockdown? I know a bunch of MFA programs ended up closing due to COVID. It was the only good thing about COVID.
Yeah. Well, so many people were available to do my podcast.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I've never lost hope, and I've never lost hope in poetry, but I have no hope whatsoever when it comes to poets. Poets are the worst thing about poetry. There are too many of them.
Oh, wow. The other thing I wanted to ask you about your poetry specifically is I can obviously see how visual aspects influence your poetry. But does the sound of words influence the words that you use in your poems?
Yeah, there's a title of a book by one of my favorite poets. His name's Clark Coolidge, and the title of the book is Sound as Thought. And it to me is a whole poetics, a whole kind of artist statement, ars poetica in a nutshell. It's the idea that the sound and the sense making are happening in tandem. And so when I'm writing, the sound is kind of leading on the phrases that I'm making. And it happens all at the same time. It's not really explainable beyond when I hear musicians talk about, especially jazz musicians talk about playing music. It's an intuitive thing. It's not. There's nothing premeditated about it, because I'm not a formal poet. I don't write in metrically formal patterns. I do write in syllabic forms. Sometimes I write poems that have a certain number of syllables per line.
Okay.
But even those poems are really dictated by the sound. The sound carries the thought, and the thought is what kind of gives the poem its shape and its images and whatever sense it's ultimately trying to make. But sound is as important as whatever the words are saying.
The combination of that and the visual aspect of the word placement. And if anybody wants an example, I would direct them to your poem Vermonter. That is the perfect combination of both aspects of I guess if you actually want to see what I'm talking about, go take a look at that poem in the written form. And it's really striking as to how much of an influence it is.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that was written on a train, and I really wanted to get the sense of movement.
Wow.
And what it looks like to just get a glimpse of something through a train window. So when the lines are kind of moving off the margin, it's like I want to create a certain kind of speed and a kind of blurring and a kind of, it's just like what maybe a sculptor is trying to achieve. Do you want to, well, I'll quote one of my favorite poets, Robert Kelly. He said, or not Robert Kelly, Robert Creeley. He said that form is never more than an extension of content. So they go hand in hand.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when did you get into photography?
It's interesting you ask in the way you put it, because if it were like 3 months ago, I would have said, I don't do photography and I don't want to talk about it, because all I do is take pictures on my phone and put them on Instagram. So I'm not a photographer. But lately I've been taking it much more seriously, thanks to the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, because they have a photo challenge every month. And they put out they put out a call for people to take pictures of light and shadow in dramatic ways. I don't know. But that got me going, because I love taking pictures of shadows and lights and light and angles and lines. I like lines. Yeah. I like how I like to find the balance.
Well, you've got an excellent eye. Thank
you. Yeah.
I've really enjoyed looking at your Instagram page.
Thanks. Yeah. So I've been using my phone in a different way. I don't just post photos immediately to Instagram. I edit them on the phone. And so now I'm just really want to get down my sense of what composition means. And I will probably soon, I'll get a digital camera and kind of upgrade equipment and learn how to use it.
Yeah.
And so it's photography is an area that I'm well into at this point.
You have a newsletter that you put out for subscribers, like every 2 weeks, and then you can do a paid subscription where there's more. How does that work? How do people subscribe to that and get your work?
Yeah, the way it's structured, so if you're a free subscriber, you'll get a poem every other week. If you're a paid subscriber, it's a poem every week. I've been keeping up with it, and I've been really enjoying it, because it's an alternative means of publication, because I don't even bother to try to get my work published in journals anymore, and mainstream poetry journals. I had poems accepted by the Colorado Review last year, and they were just at the last minute, the managing editor pulled my work, and I knew why, but they wouldn't tell me why. But I'm reaching probably more people through my Substack newsletter than I would reach anyway in the Colorado Review. And that's, I have a strong readership, and that's one of the blessings of the cancellation, is that I've had to rebuild a readership, and the readership that I've rebuilt for myself is larger than the one I had before and more responsive. And
that's wonderful.
Yeah. And the newsletter it's exciting. I'm happy to have an outlet for the work, and I'm happy to have readers. And people can find that at josephmassey.substack.com.
Have you ever thought about combining the photography and the poetry into a single piece?
I have, yeah, but the handful of times I've looked up, services or website, the cost and then the kind of cheap materials they use, it just was not appealing to me at all. No. Well,
that makes sense. Well, where can people follow you? I hate to say on social media, but that's where people follow other people most of the time and get their information. How can people follow you and get some poetry?
Twitter and Instagram, I'm active on both of those platforms, and it's the same username for each one. Just the letter J, Massey Poet. J Massey Poet at Twitter, or J Massey Poet at Instagram, and that's where they can find more.
And they can subscribe to your Substack. And this has been wonderful. If I like your style of poetry, who should I check out? Who should I backtrack and who influenced you that I really should start looking into?
I would definitely check out Laureen Niedecker,
Okay.
Niedecker. She's an amazing poet and not read enough. And I would also check out a poet named William Bronk, Bronk, who writes a really kind of philosophical poetry. It may seem dry at first, but give it some time. Give it a chance.
Okay.
Let his voice kind of work its way into your head. And I guess the last one, if I could just mention three, the other one would be Pam Rehm, Rehm. And I highly recommend any of her books. The Larger Nature, or it's called Larger Nature. That's a great book. Small Works is a great book. All of her books are great.
Last question, and I'll let you go. Looking back on it, he gets ripped for some of his poetry now. How does Jim Morrison's poetry look to you now that you're in your 40s?
I was looking at it just recently because his collected poems was published, I think, this month.
Oh, wow.
Or the collected written works or something like that. And I read the Amazon preview just to see.
Yeah.
And I think he was a incredibly promising poet. And if he had lived longer, maybe he would have been a great poet, but a lot of the poems I've seen by him now, they're fragmentary and they're not really congealing. He's still finding himself, and you have to, he died when he was 27.
Yeah.
Most poets don't find their voice, so to speak, until they're in their 30s. So
did you ever end up getting into the Doors music at all?
Yeah, very deeply actually.
Oh, cool.
And I still really like the Doors. I mean, the Doors are great. I think underrated. I think they're an amazing band.
Yeah, I think they're so unique. Their sound is just so unique. No one has done what they've done before or since. You can't replicate that sound.
You can't, and they're just amazing musicians and are completely unique and eccentric. Ray Manzarek played the bass with one hand and the bass keyboard with one hand and the keyboard with the other. I listen to live recordings and it just boggles my mind how he could do that. Yeah, they're great.
Well, I would love to have you back on anytime.
And we'll stay in touch. You're a decent guy, and I really enjoyed the conversation, man. Yeah.
To hear a poet say that makes me happy.
Yeah, it was great. Yeah, I really appreciate it.